Wait. Maybe I should sing the rockapella theme song. Nah. So yeah, today on Ancient DOS Games, in celebration of Edutainment Month, we're finally taking a look at where in the world is Carmen Sandiego, perhaps the most famous example of edutainment from the 80s and 90s, as it spawned not just one, but two television shows, including a cartoon series and a game show for kids. In fact, chances are, if you're watching this video, you've at least heard the rockapella theme song for the related game show, because it's freaking catchy as hell. Yet the question remains, why did this franchise get so popular? Well, the way the story goes, it wasn't actually intended to be edutainment. In fact, this was originally being developed to be more like an old text adventure known as Colossal Cave Adventure, but with menu selectable commands instead of having to type things into a parser. The game evolved over 2 years of development to become more about identifying geographical locations and cultural icons, with a crime-solving motif thrown in. And when it was released primarily as a consumer product for people to buy and play on their home computers. But teachers took notice, and before long, the popularity of this game had exploded within North American schools. Remember, it was the mid-80s, and edutainment titles were few and far between back then, much less any decent. Yet here was a game which was perfectly suited for a school classroom. Easy to play, heavy reliance on learning factoids from external sources without actually quizzing the players, a multi-user roster so multiple players could be tracked from the same copy of the game, and the ability to finish a single case in just 10 to 20 minutes. It was literally a perfect fit for a school environment. Now, all of that said, I never actually played the game myself until now. None of the schools I went to actually had it. I had no desire to ask for it because I was already deep into action games and RPGs when I learned about its existence. Having played it now as an adult, I can safely say that the gameplay of this game is actually very shallow and highly repetitive, but it is very clever in execution. So while the game gets old fast when you just sit down and play case after case back to back, you do end up learning things whether you intended to or not, because that repetition eventually leads to remembering factoids which help you along, which in turn leads to faster gameplay. Where in the World is Carmen Sandiego was originally developed and published by Broderbund. And yes, it's pronounced with an oo sound and not an o sound. A few people over the years have tried to incorrectly correct me on that, but the line through the o was never meant to be an indication as to proper pronunciation of the name. It was more so a reference to how zeros on mainframe computers tended to have a slash through them, thus why it's pronounced differently than it looks. I know I'm usually terrible at pronouncing things, but that name's not one of them. As for when the game was released, the original release was in 1985, making it one of the earliest games I've ever covered on the show. Technically. I'm actually playing an updated release from 1990, which included more advanced graphics and audio support, but is otherwise the same game. Though don't confuse this release of the game with the Deluxe Edition, which came out a couple years following, as the Deluxe Edition is several times larger in terms of content and is very easy to confuse visually with the original versions. As for its genre, I think the best classification here would be a one-player mystery/edutainment game. It supports a solid number of video modes from the time, and includes support for an interesting mix of audio devices as well. Though, as for its current release state, it's still commercial and has never had a digital re-release. Not even any of the later versions. Now, there have been modern remakes and reimaginings for mobile devices, but that's about it. If you want the original game, you're gonna have to go hunting on places like eBay. Unfortunately, because the game was so popular, there's copies everywhere, and they're usually priced pretty well, ranging from about $5 to $20 depending on condition. That said though, there's a couple things to keep in mind when grabbing a physical copy. Now, firstly, there's multiple versions of the original game, including the original 1985 release, the updated 1990 release, the Deluxe Edition, which followed shortly after the updated release. And they all look very similar, and they're easy to mistake for one another. So you gotta make sure you're seeing photos of the actual item being sold before you attempt to buy it. There were also releases for multiple platforms and more modern versions which came on CD, so you're gonna need to wade through all of those if you want to find a specific version of the game. Then, after all of that, you're still probably not going to find it complete in box, because most of the listings you come across will be missing the World Almanac, which was included. And at the time, that would have been absolutely necessary to play the game. Though thanks to the internet nowadays, you can probably make do perfectly fine without it. Mostly. I do have more to say about that, but let's just move on for now. So when you first start the game up, you'll be at the Acme headquarters, and you'll have to enter the name of your detective to identify yourself. Now, if said detective is not on file yet, you'll be asked if you're new to the agency, which, well, hang on, isn't that kind of a dumb question? I mean, if the name's not on file, wouldn't that be an obvious yes in this context? But what if we say no? Oh, it just has us enter our name again. I guess that makes sense then. Anyways, once you input your name, you'll have your rank indicated, and you'll be given a case to solve. Every case progresses the same way. Someone from the Villains International League of Evil, also known as Vile, will have stolen something culturally significant from a particular city, and you have to find them and recover the item. Which can include things such as the key to the Tower of London, Pizarro's sword from Lima, a secret recipe for escargot from Paris, or even the Rockettes from New York? Wait a minute, that's not a theft anymore, that's a freaking kidnapping! Holy jeez, these Vile guys mean business! So yeah, once you have your case, you always start out in the city that the crime was committed in on a Monday morning, and have until Sunday evening to find and arrest the crook. You always start out with a clue indicating the gender of the crook, which, given that there's only 5 men and 5 women who could be responsible, the list of suspects is cut in half right at the start. And, oh, wait a minute, doesn't Carmen Sandiego look like this? None of these people look like that. So, which of these crooks is Carmen Sandiego? In fact, I want everyone watching to just point at the screen right now to try and guess who in this crowd is Carmen Sandiego. You got your selection picked out? Okay, time to start blotting them out one at a time. This who you picked? Well, you're right. The original portrayal of Carmen Sandiego was far more humble, and it wouldn't be until the game show premiered in late 1991 that her iconic red trench coat and fedora hat look were cemented into the design. As even the deluxe edition of the game, which came out after the game show started airing, hadn't yet settled specifically on that look yet. Actually, I could go for some tacos too. Anyways, despite there being 10 crooks in the game, you're highly unlikely to ever go for Carmen Sandiego herself. In fact, I've been told it's possible to reach retirement in the game without ever being assigned a case where she's the suspect. Which is kind of a shame that the game doesn't really have an endgame specifically for her, but oh well, let's just get back to the gameplay itself. So pretty much everything you do in this game happens from this screen right here. Now, aside from looking up the dossiers of the crooks, you can also get a listing of all the locations you can fly to from where you are. You can go to the airport to fly to one of those destinations, hit up a local institution for a clue, or call up Interpol on your crime computer to try and narrow down your suspect so that you can get an arrest warrant. Because even if you catch the crook, if you don't have a warrant for their arrest, you don't win the case. Actually, here's a tip for this crime computer that's going to save you some in-game time. Unless you hit the compute button, you don't actually burn any time here. And chances are you'll need at least 3 of these 5 traits identified to get a warrant. So what you can do when you get a clue about the identity of the suspect is go to the crime computer, punch it in, but just right-click or escape out of this screen. The entry will still be there when you go back to add another clue in the future, and you'll have not lost any in-game time in the process. Now, the actual progression through the game is sort of a chase. When you go to a nearby location for a clue, you'll always be told something related to where the crook was headed next in their globe-trotting journey. Depending on what kind of location you go to will determine what kind of clues you're going to get in return. For instance, any location which has to do with traveling, like an airport or harbor, will often give you a clue related to the flag of the country where the crook was headed next. A bank will often tell you what currency is in use in the crook's destination country. Anything like a museum or library will often relate to something historical. And some locations I find to be questionable as to how useful their hints are. Stock exchanges, for instance, typically tell you what a common commodity is in the target country. But that's not necessarily going to be easy to look up accurate information on nowadays, given that these details are nearly 30 years out of date. Occasionally, though, the clues you get will also come with details to help identify the crook. Some clues are obvious, like if you're told the suspect had brown hair or had a tattoo, and some hints are a little less obvious, such as if you're told they had a driver with them, which tells you that they were in a limousine, while anything related to food is something you're just going to have to keep in the back of your mind or write down, as there's no means to track that on the crime computer. Plus, sometimes instead of being told someone likes tacos or seafood, you'll be told the opposite, that they hate tacos or seafood. Now, every time you do something, you're burning in-game time, so generally speaking, the fewer things you do, the better. When you depart to your next destination, if you're on the right track, you'll spot a vile henchman, and he'll get clues to help you track down the next location to fly to. However, if you lose the trail, the people will tell you that they have no idea what you're on about, in which case the best thing to do is immediately backtrack to where you just came from, as chances are high the destination you wanted to go to is not available from your current location, but backtracking is always an option. In fact, you may need to backtrack under certain conditions, and once you reach the location the crook is in, the first place you go to for a clue will have the crook attempt to murder you with a weapon of some sort. Now, if you don't have an arrest warrant yet, and you're lacking enough info to figure it out, what you can do is backtrack to the last city you were in, and just start chatting it up for clues again, hoping that you'll get a clue with some info to help identify the crook. Or you can just guess and add a piece of info to narrow it down. So long as you have at least 2 clues, it's probably going to be a 50-50 shot. In any case, find the crook in their destination city and the police will attempt to arrest them. So long as you have a warrant for the right crook, they'll go to jail and you'll win the case. If not, well, yeah, this is one depressed cop. Oh hey, I got promoted. You always get promoted after your very first case, and as you get promoted, the cases take longer to solve and might have more vague clues to go on, and use the World Almanac and Book of Facts to help you find the missing word? I don't have the almanac. This isn't required, is it? Can I just not answer the question? I got booted back to DOS. This is copy protection, isn't it? Really? Really? Like, I got the original discs right here. Like, isn't that good enough for you, game? I gotta have your multi-100-page almanac as well? Though, truth be told, some of these copy protection questions aren't actually all that hard, and you always get a hint as to how many characters there are in the answer. Now, some of them are near impossible to answer without the almanac, but thanks to the internet, you can find cheat sheets easily enough, because there's only 18 possible questions the game will ask. Not an entire almanac worth. Though mind you, the questions are different between the original release and the updated release, so do keep that in mind when you go searching. Plus, looking through all the questions and answers, I'd say half of them could be answered from personal knowledge or using online sources like Wikipedia, while the other half you would absolutely need the almanac for because they're either based on information which could have changed since being published, or because the answer is a relative observation that would be extraordinarily difficult to pin down without context for the kind of answer expected. However, the only punishment for failing to answer the copy protection question is being booted back to DOS, and you still get to experience the game at its lowest level of difficulty for one case each time you start it up. So as far as copy protection goes, it's one of the least crippling that I've come across. But that's pretty much it for the game. Beyond what I've just shown and talked about, there is literally nothing more to it. And that's why repetition sets in extremely quickly, because in order to quote-unquote beat the game by reaching retirement, you have to solve an extremely large number of cases. Now, from what I understand, this varies significantly depending on the version of the game as to how many cases you need to solve to max out your rank and potentially take down Carmen Sandiego. But I can't find any decent info online as to how long it takes for the DOS 1990 version specifically. But quite frankly, I wasn't about to spend several hours trying to find out. The one final thing of note is that even though the game primarily runs in a 320 by 200 screen format, the Hercules mode, surprisingly, runs in a sort of windowed system where you can click and drag various windows around. The game still primarily runs in a single window, so there's no real reason for the game to run this way, though it's still interesting that this is even a feature. Overall, I get it. I get why this became as popular as it did, even though it was entirely by accident at first, and that's because it follows one of the fundamental guidelines for making good edutainment. Don't quiz the player. Okay, yeah, it flat out quizzes you for the copy protection, but the main gameplay never actively quizzes you on anything. Instead, you get hints, and then through your own means, either by memory or by looking up info that was in the once included almanac or through other sources, you have to use those hints to determine where to go next based on what locations are even available for you to move to. The player learns through progression rather than from just flat out having to remember things, and that is the mark of truly excellent edutainment. But, as a game, it is incredibly simple and repetitive, and not something I felt like continuing to play once I solved a solid number of cases, because I knew what to expect going forward, and every case just became following the motions to success, rarely ever making mistakes. I'd say if you've never played this game before, then it's absolutely worth checking out at least once to experience it if you can. But you're not actually missing much if you've never played it. Though it's definitely a more suitable experience for kids over adults. So for those of you who have children, this would be an excellent game to introduce them to once they're ready for concepts like history and geography. The game runs mostly fine in DOSBox with the auto or max cycle settings, but I found setting a fixed rate of 5,000 cycles made the audio a little more stable overall. The game is otherwise hassle-free to get working properly. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Next week for ADG Pro, we're sticking with the edutainment theme and checking out how to get, or at least calculate, the maximum scores possible in a particular game. And notice how I said scores plural, so make sure to tune in next Saturday to see how this one goes down. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small selection of you guys.
Well, she sneaks around the world from Kiev to Carolina. She's a sticky-fingered filcher from Berlin down to Belize. She'll take you for a ride on a slow boat to China. Tell me, where in the world is Carmen Sandiego?